The sky above the Yalu River was not merely a combat zone, it was a sanctuary. For the pilots of the Soviet 64th Fighter Aviation Corps, specifically the elite aces stationed at the Antung Airfield Complex in China, this stretch of airspace was supposed to be their hunting ground. The date is October 23, 1951. To the rest of the world, the Korean War is a grinding stalemate on the ground. But here, 40,000 feet above the jagged peaks of the borderlands, a secret war is raging. A war that officially does not exist. The men in these cockpits are not North Korean conscripts. They are seasoned veterans of the Second World War, Soviet pilots flying clandestinely with Chinese markings on their silver fuselages. They sit at the controls of the MiG-15, a machine that the Soviet Union believes to be the pinnacle of aerodynamic engineering. Up until this moment, their confidence is absolute. They have been told, and they have observed, that their aircraft can climb faster, fly higher, and hit harder than anything the capitalist West can throw at them. They are the apex predators of the stratosphere. But on this crisp Tuesday morning, the laws of physics seem to break. The mission begins with a routine intercept. Soviet radar operators, huddled in damp bunkers along the Yalu, pick up a massive signature. It is a raid. 8 B-29 Superfortress bombers, the lumbering giants of the American Strategic Fleet, are heading for Namsi Airfield. They are escorted by 55 F-84 Thunderjets and, critically, a screen of 34 F-86 Sabres. The Soviet commanders see this as a gift. They scramble nearly 60 MiG-15 fighters. The math is simple. The MiG-15 fighter has a service ceiling of over 50,000 feet. The American Sabres struggle to maneuver effectively above 40,000. The plan is textbook. The Soviet formation will climb high into the thin air where the Americans cannot touch them, and then dive upon the bombers like hawks striking slow-moving prey. It should have been a slaughter of American bombers. Instead, the Soviet pilots fly into a meat grinder. As the formation crosses the river, the air fills with the chaotic static of Russian radio chatter. The flight leaders call for the climb. They push their throttles, feeling the raw thrust of the Klimov VK-1 engine. They ascend rapidly, looking down at the American formation. From this altitude, the F-86 Sabre aircraft looks small, almost insignificant. The Soviet pilots prepare to execute their standard attack. A high-speed dive, a burst of heavy cannon fire from their 37mm and 23mm guns, and a rapid zoom climb back to safety. It is a tactic that relies on energy and altitude. It is a tactic that has worked before. But today, something is wrong. As the lead MiG-15 fighters roll over into their dive, the American escort does not behave as predicted. The F-86 Sabres do not scatter. They do not sluggishly attempt to climb and stall out. Instead, they turn into the attack with a fluidity and precision that defies the Soviet understanding of the Sabres' capabilities. The distance closes rapidly. The Soviet pilots attempt to line up their shots. Their gun sights are primitive, vibrating violently with the airframe at high speeds. They rely on closing to close range, spraying massive shells, hoping for a catastrophic hit. But before they can even get the B-29 bombers into a reliable firing solution, the air around them erupts. Tracers. Not the heavy, slow-firing rounds of a cannon, but a dense, terrifying stream of 50-caliber, armor-piercing incendiary rounds. The Soviet pilots wrench their sticks, expecting the Sabres to be hundreds of yards behind, struggling to get a lead. But the American fighters are there. They are right there, and they are not missing. One MiG-15 fighter disintegrates in a ball of orange flame, its fuel tanks ruptured by a precision burst that seemed to come from an impossible angle. Another pilot, an ace with multiple kills, pulls hard into a vertical climb, confident that the heavy American jet cannot follow him. He looks back, expecting to see the Sabre stalling, falling away toward the earth. Instead, he sees the glint of the silver wings pursuing him. The Sabre is firing. The rounds impact the MiG's tail section, with the sound of a jackhammer tearing through sheet metal. The controls go slack. The Soviet pilot ejects into the freezing slipstream, watching his invincible machine spiral down into the rice paddies below. This is the chaos of Black Thursday. Before we dive deeper into this impossible massacre, if you want to understand the hidden technologies and secret histories that define the 20th century, make sure you are subscribed to Cold War Impact. We uncover the stories the history books missed. Back in the skies over Namsi, the confusion is turning into panic. The Soviet radio channels are screaming. Pilots are shouting that they are being hit from distances that make no sense. They report that the Americans are firing while maneuvering, while turning, while diving at speeds that should make accurate gunnery impossible. In 1951, aerial gunnery is supposed to be an art of estimation, a guess and spray game played at 600 miles per hour. You have to predict where the enemy will be, lead the target, compensate for bullet drop, and hope your own plane is stable enough to fire. Yet, the American pilots seem to be playing a different game entirely. It is as if they are connected to their targets by invisible wires. A Soviet flight leader, struggling to shake a Sabre off his 6 o'clock, pulls a high G-turn. The MiG-15 fighter turns tighter than the Sabre. This is an aerodynamic fact. He should be safe. But the stream of 50 caliber bullets arcs through the sky and finds him anyway. It is uncanny. It is mechanical. It feels less like a dogfight and more like an execution. By the time the engagement ends, the statistics are grim. While the Soviets managed to down several B-29 bombers, the cost to their fighter force is catastrophic in terms of tactical shock. The Americans claim 8 MiG-15 aircraft destroyed. The Soviets admit to losing aircraft, but the numbers on paper matter less than the psychological impact on the survivors. They land their surviving jets at Antung, the tires screeching on the tarmac, the engines cooling with the ticking sound of contracting metal. The pilots climb out of their cockpits, faces pale, hands shaking. These are men who fought the Luftwaffe. They know what combat is, but this was different. They gather in the debriefing rooms, smoking nervously, trying to articulate what they just experienced. They speak of the invisible hand. They speak of American tracers that seem to curve into them. They describe Sabres that locked onto them instantaneously without the usual jockeying for position. The wreckage of the downed MiG-15 aircraft smokes in the North Korean hills, but the smoke rising from the minds of the Soviet command is far more dangerous. They are facing a crisis of confidence. The MiG-15 was their ace in the hole. It was the aircraft that was supposed to guarantee that the American atomic bombers, the B-29s and the upcoming B-36s, could never penetrate Soviet airspace. If the MiG-15 can be swept aside so easily by the F-86 Sabre, then the motherland is naked. The report that goes up the chain of command to Moscow is filled with contradictions. The pilots claim the Americans have a new engine, or perhaps a new type of ammunition. Some even speculate about a proximity fuse for machine gun bullets, similar to the anti-aircraft shells used in the Second World War. But the most terrifying theory is that the Americans have solved the problem of the human element. At these speeds, the human eye and the human brain are the limiting factors. A pilot cannot calculate lead angles fast enough when two jets are closing at a combined speed of 1,200 miles per hour. If the Americans have found a way to bridge that gap, to make the impossible shot possible, then the Soviet Union is not just losing a battle in Korea, they are losing the future of aerial warfare. The premise of the Soviet defense strategy relies on the interceptor. The geography of the USSR is vast. They cannot rely on static defenses everywhere. They need fast, deadly aircraft to swarm incoming bombers. The MiG-15 is that aircraft. It was designed specifically to destroy the B-29, and yet, on this Black Thursday, the B-29s were the bait, and the MiG-15 fighters were the victims. What is happening inside the cockpit of the F-86 Sabre? That is the question haunting the Soviet generals. They examine the gun camera footage from their own surviving planes. They see the Sabres engaging from long ranges that Soviet doctrine says are a waste of ammunition. And yet, the Sabre bullets are hitting. They are hitting the engines, the cockpits, the wing roots. The mystery deepens when intelligence officers analyze the debris of American aircraft downed in previous months. They look for clues. They strip down the engines, the radios, the hydraulic systems. They find excellent craftsmanship, yes. They find durable materials. But they do not find the magic weapon. The Sabre has 6 standard Colt Browning machine guns. It has a standard engine. It is slightly heavier than the MiG. It climbs slower. On paper, it is inferior. So, why are the MiG-15 fighters falling? The confusion at the Antung airbase turns into paranoia. Is there a spy? Are the Americans listening to their tactical frequencies and anticipating their moves, or is it something more fundamental? The pilots begin to doubt their own machines. They complain about the MiG's instability at high Mach numbers. They complain about the snaking oscillation that makes aiming the heavy cannons so difficult. But these complaints were always there. They do not explain the sudden disparity in lethality. The sun sets over the Yalu, casting long shadows over the airfield. The mechanics work through the night, patching bullet holes, refueling the hungry jets. But they cannot patch the morale of the pilots. The rumor spreads through the barracks. The Americans have a ghost in the machine, a technology that sees what cannot be seen. The stakes are existential. If the Kremlin cannot secure its airspace in Korea, how can it secure the skies over Moscow? Joseph Stalin is watching. The pressure is immense. The order comes down from the highest levels. Find out how they are doing it. Find out why our eagles are falling to their hawks. The hunt for the answer begins, but the Soviets are looking in the wrong places. They are looking for a bigger gun, a faster engine, a thicker armor plate. They do not realize that the answer lies in a small, humming box of vacuum tubes and gyroscopes, a device that is currently sitting in the cockpit of every F-86 Sabre across the river, waiting to kill them again tomorrow. The dust had barely settled on the runways of Antung before the Inquisition began. The Soviet command structure does not tolerate failure, especially when that failure involves the loss of secret technology and elite personnel. The command bunker of the 64th Fighter Aviation Corps turned into a hive of frantic activity. General Georgy Lobov, a man under immense pressure from Moscow, demanded an explanation. How could a formation of MiG-15 aircraft, possessing superior altitude and climb rates, be dismantled so thoroughly by an inferior American jet? The investigation was not a calm scientific inquiry. It was a witch hunt fueled by desperation. Technicians swarmed the surviving MiG-15 fighters as they taxied in. They stripped the airframes, looking for evidence of a new American weapon. Had the Americans developed a death ray? Were they using a new type of high-velocity ammunition that shattered the MiG's airframe upon impact? The mechanics dug 50-caliber bullets out of the aluminum skin of the returning jets. They weighed them. They analyzed the metallurgy. They found nothing special. It was standard American ordnance: copper, lead, and steel. This terrified the engineers even more. If the bullets were standard, then the delivery system was supernatural. Inside the debriefing rooms, the pilots were grilled until they were exhausted. Intelligence officers demanded to know the exact flight parameters of the engagement. They drew diagrams on chalkboards, calculating angles and speeds. The math simply did not add up. "He shot me from a 30-degree deflection angle," one pilot insisted, his hands mimicking the dogfight. "At a range of 800 meters. The intelligence officers shook their heads. "Impossible," they argued. "At that speed and angle, the American pilot would see you for a fraction of a second. The nose of his plane would block his view. He cannot calculate the lead. You are mistaken." But the reports kept coming. Pilot after pilot described the same phenomenon. The Sabres were firing before they were in position. They were firing into empty air, and the MiG-15 aircraft were flying right into the stream of bullets, as if it were preordained. It was as if the American pilots could see into the future. The Soviet engineers began to look inward, scrutinizing their own equipment. They knew the MiG-15 had flaws. At high speeds, approaching the sound barrier, the aircraft suffered from snaking, a lateral instability where the nose would wander left and right. This made the MiG a terrible gun platform at high Mach numbers. To hit anything, a Soviet pilot had to get close, dangerously close, and slow down to stabilize. They assumed the Americans must suffer from the same aerodynamic laws. They assumed the F-86 Sabre, being a swept-wing jet of similar generation, would also wobble and snake at high speeds. Therefore, the Americans should be missing. The theory of a gyro-stabilized superpilot began to take hold in the barracks. The Soviets speculated that the Americans were selecting only their most freakishly gifted marksmen for the Sabre squadrons, men with unnatural reflexes. But statistically, this was impossible. There were too many Sabres, and they were all too accurate. You cannot mass-produce genius. Then came the darker theories. The KGB officers embedded with the unit suggested that there was a traitor. Perhaps the Americans had broken the Soviet tactical codes. Perhaps they were being guided by a new high-definition ground radar that vectored them into perfect firing solutions. To test this, the Soviet tactics changed. They tried to lure the Sabres into energy traps. The MiGs would spiral up, dragging the Sabres into the thin air where the MiG engine was king. But the Sabres refused to play the game on Soviet terms. They would break off, reposition, and then with that terrifying, unnatural precision, snap off a burst of gunfire from below that would tear a wing off a climbing MiG. The paranoia reached a fever pitch. The The Soviet gun sight, the ASP-1 Newton, was a copy of a British design from the Second World War. It was a decent piece of kit, a gyroscopic sight that helped estimate the lead, but it was manual. The pilot had to set the target's wingspan, estimate the range, and fly a smooth curve for seconds to let the gyro settle. In a jet dogfight lasting split seconds, it was often useless. Soviet pilots frequently caged the gyro and just used the fixed crosshairs, firing by instinct. They assumed the Americans were doing the same. They could not conceive that the Americans had removed the estimation from the equation entirely. The breaking point came when a Soviet recovery team managed to reach the wreckage of an F-86 Sabre that had crashed in the tidal flats a few weeks prior. The aircraft was mangled, destroyed by the impact and the tides. But the Soviets weren't interested in the wings or the engine. They wanted the cockpit. They wanted the magic box. They found shattered glass and twisted wires. The unit they pulled from the wreckage was a dense, heavy component from the instrument panel. It was smashed beyond recognition, but it was clearly complex. Far too complex for a simple optical sight. It was packed with delicate gears, vacuum tubes, and electrical servos. The Soviet engineers stared at the mangled mess of wires in a laboratory in Moscow. This was not just a sight, it looked like a computer. But that was ridiculous. Computers in 1951 were the size of rooms, filling entire basements in universities. You could not put a computer into the nose of a fighter jet. The vibration alone would destroy the vacuum tubes. And yet, the evidence of the air war said otherwise. The Americans were hitting targets that they shouldn't be able to hit. The Soviet investigation concluded that the Americans had achieved a breakthrough in miniaturization that was 10 years ahead of Soviet science. They dubbed the mysterious device the black box. But knowing it existed and understanding how it worked were two different things. The pilots at Antung were still flying out every day, looking over their shoulders, terrified of the invisible line of mathematics that was tracking them through the clouds. They were fighting a ghost. They started to fly more conservatively. The aggression of the early war evaporated. The MiG alley, that was supposed to be a Soviet fortress, became a graveyard. While the Soviets were chasing theories of super pilots and ground-based conspiracies, they failed to realize that the answer was staring them in the face. It wasn't about who had the faster plane. It was about who had the faster brain. And the Americans had outsourced the thinking to a machine. The investigation stalled, the losses mounted. The Soviet command needed a miracle. They needed to steal the secret intact. But while they plotted to capture a ghost, thousands of miles away, in a brightly lit laboratory in the United States, American engineers were already working on the upgrade. They weren't just satisfied with shooting down MiGs, they wanted to make it automatic. While the Soviet generals in Moscow were chasing shadows and interrogating their own pilots for cowardice, the answer to their nightmare was sitting calmly on a workbench in a classified laboratory thousands of miles away. It was not a new type of gunpowder, nor was it an alien alloy. It was a triumph of mathematics, miniaturization, and American industrial audacity. The location is the Massachusetts Institute of Technology, specifically the Instrumentation Laboratory, led by the brilliant Dr. Charles Stark Draper. But the practical application is happening on the factory floors of the Sperry Gyroscope Company and Hughes Aircraft. The project is born from a simple, terrifying realization that American strategists made at the dawn of the jet age: the human brain is obsolete. In the Second World War, a pilot in a P-51 Mustang fought at 300 miles per hour. He could see his enemy, estimate the distance, guess the lead, how far ahead to shoot, and pull the trigger. It was an athletic skill, like shooting a duck on the wing. But a jet dogfight happens at 600 miles per hour, often with closing speeds over 1,000 miles per hour. At those velocities, the geometry of engagement changes faster than the human optical nerve can transmit signals to the brain. By the time a pilot realizes where the enemy is already gone. If the United States wanted to dominate the skies over Korea, they couldn't just build better planes, they had to build a better pilot. Since they couldn't upgrade the human, they decided to install a synthetic brain in the cockpit. This was the birth of the AUNI centimeter gun sight, coupled with the AN divided by APG-30 radar ranging system. To the untrained eye, the F-86 Sabre looked like a standard fighter jet. But hidden inside the lips of the nose intake, right above the air duct, was a small black radome. Inside that radome sat a technological marvel, a compact radar dish that acted as the eye of the machine. Unlike the massive search radars used by ground control to find fleets of bombers, the AN divided by APG-30 was not designed to find the enemy. It was designed to measure them. It was a range-only radar. When an American pilot pointed his nose at a MiG-15 fighter, the radar emitted a focused beam of energy. This beam would bounce off the Soviet jet and return to the Sabre in microseconds. This is where the magic happened. The radar data, the exact, down to the yard distance to the target, was fed instantly into an analog computer located behind the dashboard. This was not a digital computer with chips. Silicon chips did not exist. This was an electromechanical brain made of spinning gears, cams, vacuum tubes, and electrical servos. It was a piece of clockwork genius. The computer took the range data from the radar. It simultaneously took data from the aircraft's own sensors: airspeed, altitude, G-force, and angle of attack. It crunched these variables in real time. It calculated the drop of the .50 caliber bullet due to gravity. It calculated the windage created by the jet's movement. It calculated the time of flight for the bullet to reach the target. And then, it displayed the solution. Inside the cockpit, the American pilot looked through a piece of angled glass called the combining glass. Projected onto that glass was a glowing orange circle with a dot in the center, the pipper. In a standard sight, that dot is fixed. In the Sabre, the dot was alive. As the pilot maneuvered, the computer physically moved the image of the reticle on the glass. It was telling the pilot, "Do not look at the enemy. Look at the dot. If you put the dot on the enemy, the bullets will hit." This was the invisible hand the Soviets felt. When a Soviet pilot turned hard to the left, the American pilot didn't have to guess how far to lead him. The radar felt the distance changing. The gyros felt the turn. The computer moved the dot ahead of the MiG-15 fighter. The American pilot simply flew his plane to keep the dot on the silver wings of the MiG and squeezed the trigger. The system allowed American pilots to fire accurately from ranges of 1,000 yards or more, distances the Soviets considered impossible. It allowed them to score hits while pulling high G-turns, where a human pilot would be struggling just to keep their head up, let alone do trigonometry. This technology represented a fundamental shift in the philosophy of war. The Soviet approach was to build a rugged, powerful tractor of a plane, the MiG-15, and rely on the raw courage and instinct of the new Soviet man. The American approach was to build a system that compensated for human frailty. The engineering challenge to make this work was staggering. The vacuum tubes inside the Aoni centimeter sight had to withstand the violence of a carrier landing and the vibration of 6 machine guns firing simultaneously. The radar had to distinguish between a MiG-15 fighter and the ground clutter when looking down. The complexity was such that, initially, the systems were prone to failure. In the early days, the vacuum tubes would burn out, or the vibration would shake a gear loose. American mechanics cursed the black boxes as temperamental junk. But as the war progressed, the systems were refined. They became ruggedized. And in the hands of the pilots who learned to trust them, they were devastating. Consider the experience of an American ace like Captain James Jabara. He dives on a formation of MiGs. He is moving at Mach 0.9. The world is a blur. He selects a target. He doesn't squint and guess. He watches his radar range indicator unspool. 2,000 yards. 1,500 yards. The radar target light on his dash flickers on a solid lock. The computer has the MiG. The reticle steadies. The math is done. He fires. The bullets leave the Sabre's guns. They arc through the air, governed by physics that the computer has already predicted. The MiG pilot, 800 yards away, thinks he is safe. He thinks he has time to maneuver, but the bullets arrive exactly where his plane is going to be. This was the source of the curving bullets myth. From the Soviet perspective, the tracers seemed to hunt them down. In reality, the American bullets were flying straight. It was the precision of the lead angle that made them seem supernatural. The computer was putting the rounds into a virtual basket that the MiG was flying into. The disparity in technology created a disparity in psychology. American pilots flew with the confidence of men who had a secret weapon. They knew that if they could get within range and get a lock, the kill was highly probable. They became aggressive. They pushed the Sabre to its limits because they didn't have to save their focus for the complex geometry of gunnery. The machine did that for them. They could focus entirely on flying. Meanwhile, the Soviet designers were still trying to perfect the stadiometric, ranging on the ASP-1 Newton sight. This required the pilot to twist a handle on the throttle to match the size of a diamond in the sight to the wingspan of the target. It was a manual, clumsy process that required the pilot to take his hand off the throttle during a dogfight. It was a design from 1944 fighting against a design from 1951. The secret of the Sabre wasn't just that it was a good jet, it was that it was the first weapon system. It was the ancestor of the modern fighter jet, where the radar and the fire control computer are just as important as the wings and the engine. While the Soviets were desperately searching for a spy, the spy was actually a series of equations hardwired into the circuitry of the American fleet. The Americans had industrialized the art of killing. They had turned the chaotic, artistic duel of the skies into a cold, hard calculation. But the Soviets were about to get a wake-up call. They couldn't hide from the truth forever. The mystery of the impossible shots was about to be solved, and the revelation would shake the Soviet military-industrial complex to its core. The mystery of the invisible hand killing Soviet pilots did not end in the skies over Korea. It ended on a muddy, frozen, tidal flat on the North Korean coast. For months, the Kremlin had been screaming for a sample. Stalin himself was reportedly furious. The reports from the front were consistent. The Americans were shooting with impossible accuracy. The Soviet aviation industry, proud of its aerodynamic achievements, refused to believe their planes were inferior. They needed physical proof. They needed a body. The order went out to the 64th Fighter Aviation Corps. Do not just shoot them down, bring one down intact. It was a suicide mission. To force a jet fighter to land, you have to damage it just enough to cripple its engine but not enough to destroy its controls, all while flying at 600 miles per hour. But finally, luck and American misfortune favored the Soviets. An F-86 Sabre, piloted by an American aviator who had strayed too far or suffered a mechanical failure, was forced to ditch in the coastal shallows. The tide was out. The aircraft was largely intact. The recovery operation was a scene of frantic violence. American fighters and bombers swarmed the area, trying to strafe and destroy their own downed technology to keep it from falling into enemy hands. Soviet and Chinese ground troops, under heavy fire, dragged the Silver Bird out of the mud using oxen and tractors, camouflaging it with reeds and snow. They disassembled it in the dark, loaded the pieces onto trucks, and drove them north, across the Yalu, and onto a train bound for Moscow. The destination was a secret research institute known as NII-17, the heart of Soviet radar and avionics development. The crate containing the Sabre's nose section was pried open. The engineers gathered around, tools in hand, ready to dissect the beast. They expected to find a clever optical trick, perhaps a new type of gyroscopic dampener. What they found instead silenced the room. As they pulled away the aluminum skin of the intake lip, they found the black radome. Inside was the antenna for the AN divided by APG-30. They traced the heavy shielded cables back to the cockpit, to the black box behind the instrument panel. They opened the casing of the computer. It was a moment of profound, sinking realization. Inside the box was a dense, intricate city of miniature vacuum tubes, precision-machined gears, and potentiometers. The build quality was exquisite. It was unlike anything produced in the Soviet Union. Soviet radios were heavy, clunky, and built with large tolerances. This American device was like a Swiss watch married to a supercomputer. The lead engineers realized immediately what they were looking at. It wasn't a sight, it was a fully integrated fire control system. The shock moment rippled through the Soviet military establishment. The report that landed on the desks of the general staff was devastating. It confirmed their worst fears. The Americans weren't just better pilots. They weren't just using better tactics. They were fighting a different kind of war. The report detailed that the American system was effectively automating the kill. While a Soviet pilot was wrestling with his stick, trying to manually calculate lead, wind, and drop, the American pilot was simply placing a pip on a target. The American plane was doing the math. But the true horror for the Soviets wasn't just the existence of the device, it was the industrial implication. To build this unit, the Americans needed a level of manufacturing precision that the Soviet economy simply did not possess in 1951. The miniature vacuum tubes alone were a marvel. The Soviets struggled to produce reliable standard tubes. These ruggedized, thumbnail-sized components were years beyond their reach. The Soviet response was one of desperate imitation. The order came down, copy it, now. They designated the project Kvant, Quantum. They tried to reverse engineer the AN divided by APG-30 radar and the AON centimeter sight. But the process was a nightmare. When they tried to replicate the complex gears, their machining tools weren't precise enough. When they tried to make the vacuum tubes, the failure rate was 70%. The resulting Soviet copy, the SRD-3 radar rangefinder, was heavier, larger, and far less reliable than the American original. It overheated. It broke down under the G-forces of combat. It was a pale shadow of the American tech. Confronted with the reality that they could not match the American offensive capability, the Soviets were forced to adopt a defensive, almost humiliating countermeasure. If they couldn't build a computer to shoot the Americans down, they had to build a device to run away from them. They accelerated the development of the Sirena radar warning receiver. This was a crude system installed in the tail of the MiG-15 and the newer MiG-17. It was designed to pick up the pulse of the American AN divided by APG-30 radar. Think about the psychological shift this represents. The Soviet strategy went from "we are the hunters" to "we need a sensor to tell us when the Americans are looking at us so we can break." The Sirena system was simple. When an American Sabre locked onto a MiG, the radar beam would trigger a sensor in the MiG's tail, and a loud, terrified squeal would sound in the Soviet pilot's headset. It was effectively a panic alarm. This was the reveal of the Cold War's true nature. The MiG-15 was a beautiful, powerful flying machine, a testament to Soviet aerodynamic brilliance, but it was dumb. The F-86 Sabre was a weapon system, a testament to American electronic dominance. The pilots at Antung were briefed on the findings. The news was grim. There was no magic trick they could learn to counter it. There was no maneuver that could fool the radar computer. The only advice was, do not fly in a straight line for more than 2 seconds. The Soviet aces, men who had pinned medals on their chests for bravery, realized they were now just targets in a video game that the Americans were playing. They continued to fly, and they continued to fight bravely. They pushed the MiG-17 into service, a faster, tighter-turning jet. But the technological gap in avionics remained a yawning chasm. The massacre of Black Thursday was not a fluke. It was a demonstration of a new reality. The age of the night of the air was over. The age of the microprocessor, the sensor, and the algorithm had begun. And in that race, the Soviet Union had just realized it was starting miles behind the starting line. They tried to hide this failure from the world. Propaganda films continued to show the MiG as the supreme fighter. But inside the closed cities of the Soviet military-industrial complex, the panic was real. They knew that if war broke out in Europe, if the balloon went up, their air force, blind and dumb compared to the Americans, would be swept from the skies by invisible math. The Korean War ended in an uneasy armistice in July 1953, but the shockwaves of Black Thursday and the subsequent air war reverberated for decades. When the final tallies were counted, the numbers painted a stark picture of the technological disparity. The United States Air Force claimed a kill ratio of 10-1. They stated that 792 MiG-15 aircraft were shot down by Sabres, for the loss of only 78 F-86 Sabres. Historians and modern analysis of Soviet archives have since debated these numbers. Against the elite Soviet pilots of the 64th Corps, the ratio was likely much tighter, perhaps 2-1 or 3-1, in favor of the Americans. But statistics, in this case, obscure the deeper truth. The critical victory was not just in the number of airframes destroyed, it was in the validation of a philosophy. The American reliance on complex, expensive, and fragile electronics, the black boxes, was vindicated. The Soviet philosophy of rugged simplicity was exposed as a liability in the face of the information age. This technological divergence defined the remainder of the Cold War. While the Soviet Union continued to pour resources into building faster and higher-flying aircraft like the MiG-21 and the MiG-25, chasing the raw metrics of speed and altitude, the United States doubled down on the invisible war. They invested billions into radar, fire control computers, and eventually the microchips that would power the digital revolution. The AON centimeter gun sight and the AN divided by APG-30 radar were the ancestors of the modern head-up display and the sophisticated avionics suites found in today's F-35 and F-22 fighters. The American military realized early on that in the future of warfare, the pilot with the most information wins. The Soviets, by contrast, fell into a trap of imitation. They spent the 1960s and 1970s desperately trying to steal or reverse engineer Western electronics. They created the copy culture that rotted their military-industrial complex from the inside. They could build a titanium hull for a submarine or a massive rocket engine, but they could not mass-produce the delicate, high-precision circuit boards required to make them smart. This failure began in the skies over Korea. The inability to replicate the Sabres' fire control system was the canary in the coal mine. It was the first clear sign that the industrial contest between capitalism and communism would not be decided by steel production, but by computing power. By the time the 1980s arrived, the gap had become unbridgeable. In the Bekaa Valley in 1982, Israeli F-15 and F-16 fighters descendants of the Sabre concept annihilated Syrian MiG-21 and MiG-23 aircraft by the score. The result was 82-0. The ghost in the machine that terrified the pilots at Antung had evolved into an omnipotent digital god. The legacy of Black Thursday is not just a story of a dogfight, it is the moment the night of the air, the romantic notion of the pilot relying solely on his eyes and his gut died. He was replaced by the system's operator. On that fateful day in 1951, the Soviet pilots looked out of their canopies and saw the future. They saw a machine that could think faster than they could. They saw a weapon that did not hesitate, did not blink, and did not miss. They were prepared to fight men. They were not prepared to fight math. And in the end, that is the terrifying efficiency of American dominance. It wasn't that the American pilots were braver. It wasn't even that their planes were faster. It was that they had turned the chaos of war into a solvable equation. And for the pilots of the MiG-15 aircraft, spiraling down in flames over the Yalu River, the solution to that equation was zero.